Yo, what's up? Week 17 of the NFL season is officially here. This is No Huddle Fantasy Sports, and although the NFL regular season is coming to an end, along with a lot of your season-long fantasy football leagues, there still is a ton of fantasy football to be played, and that includes Week 17 and into the NFL playoffs. We have daily fantasy sports. There's money on the table. There's money to be won, and so whether you won your season-long fantasy football championship and are hungry for more, or simply didn't make the playoffs, but still want to prove you're the best fantasy player in town, I've got good news for you. We are covering all that and more in this video today. We're talking daily fantasy sports, DFS, DraftKings, FanDuel, top players, best players, core players, players that I truly believe that you can build your lineups around this weekend in DFS to make sure you are successful and win some extra cash. Hey guys, and welcome back to No Huddle Fantasy Sports. Welcome back to the channel, the video here on YouTube. I do appreciate you always tuning in. This is Week 17 of the NFL season. We're talking about Week 17 DFS Core Plays. This, of course, is the end of the regular season. This major big slate on the NFL schedule, especially for DraftKings and FanDuel DFS purposes. But nonetheless, Week 17 does present us with one of the largest slates of the year, being that most teams, every team is playing on Sunday, and the only exception to the main slate is a Sunday night game. So essentially we have a full slate of games, but there's a couple disclaimers, a couple things I do want to note about Week 17. Week 17 is unlike any other week of the season. There's a lot of different things that have to be considered, and I want to caution you. First and foremost, this is a different approach compared to previous weeks. We have to consider a lot of different factors. Some of those include rested players, playoff scenarios, realistic record-breaking performances. We know certain things. We know which teams are playing for playoff spots, which teams are eliminated, which coaches are going to rest players, but some of that doesn't come out right away. Some of that might come out tomorrow. There's a lot of different factors, as I mentioned, so I cannot stress to you enough to do your research. All that is vitally important to be successful in Week 17. It's a difficult week to bet. It's a difficult week for DFS unless you know how to approach it, which is exactly what we're going to talk about in this video. All of that being said, it is Week 17. It's the end of the regular season, and this is one of the last major videos I'll put out regarding fantasy football and DFS on the year. And I do have to thank you guys. I do have to thank you guys for following along, whether you're a subscriber or simply a viewer on this video, whether you've been with me since the beginning or jumped on midway through the season. I do really appreciate it. I can't believe how fast No Huddle Fantasy Sports has grown. It's simply been awesome. So I have to give you guys a big thank you. I wish you all a happy holiday season, a Merry Christmas, and of course a Happy New Year as we jump into 2020. If you're watching this video, I mention it every single week, and you haven't subscribed to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. It's really freaking easy to do. Come on guys, just smash that subscribe button. Give these videos a like if they do help you. It's the easiest way you can help support No Huddle Fantasy Sports. It'll make sure you're not only keeping up to date with the football videos, but as we approach spring and MLB comes around, we have more and more content related to that being pushed out. You'll stay up to date with that. So again, thank you guys so much for all the support, but you're here for Week 17. And I already talked about somewhat of the approach in how we should, what teams are playing, especially for playoff spots. One way or another, these teams are playing for a playoff spot. That's the Dallas Cowboys, Green Bay Packers, Kansas City Chiefs, New England Patriots, New Orleans Saints, Oakland Raiders, Philadelphia Eagles, Pittsburgh Steelers, and Tennessee Titans. I think with that list of teams, that is the safest list of players and teams. They are playing for either a higher seed in the playoffs, they're locking up a division, they might be on the outside looking in, but regardless, each one of those teams listed has something to play for in Week 17 and thus should be full go in terms of their players. Could things happen? Yes. For example, I guess if Kansas City notices that New England's getting blown out by Miami, they could throttle back and take it easy and bench some players if they're up a lot in the fourth quarter. Those things could happen, but for the most part, the NFL schedules does a good job scheduling teams at the same time so that things like that can't happen. Outcomes won't be determined until exactly the same time. These are all teams, again, that will be playing in Week 17, and I think for fantasy football purposes, for DFS purposes, you can pick players from these teams. This other side of the list here, Arizona Cardinals all the way down to the Washington Redskins, are teams that should be playing all of their players, but we don't have exact clarity. They're not really playing for anything, but they're not giving an indication that they won't be playing their starters, that they'll be benching players. So I think you're pretty safe playing any of the teams listed on the right. Outside of injuries and your typical weekly stuff that you should pay attention to, all of those teams should be playing. Moving on here to a maybe. And these are teams that I think you have to pay attention to up until the wire. Even then, it still is risky. The maybes are the Houston Texans and the Los Angeles Rams. I say this because the Houston Texans are pretty much, they're locked into the playoffs. They're locked into their division. They could jump as high as to number 3 in terms of seeding, but it takes a couple of things to happen, a couple of other losses. I think that they're pretty much locked into that 4 seed. With that said, they're saying they're going to play their players. Some of them are questionable. I don't know why they would, especially with that lock. It's a little bit of a risk here. LA Rams are a team that's not really playing for anything other than pride, but McVay and some of their coaches have hinted that they may rest players. There's a chance that backup quarterbacks play, so it's a little bit risky with the Rams. They're on my maybe list. Lastly here, these are teams I'm pretty much avoiding. We know that guys are not playing from these teams, and when I say I'm avoiding, you could play backup players that are for certain to play. For example, Baltimore Ravens are resting Lamar Jackson. You could play, theoretically, Robert Griffin III. He should play the whole game. But Baltimore Ravens, Buffalo Bills, Minnesota Vikings all have locked in their spots in the playoffs. They can't go up, they can't go down. So they should be, one way or another, resting players. And for my purposes, I'm avoiding them in DFS just to avoid that headache. So as I mentioned, those are the teams listed out. I talked about playoff scenarios, how important they are. I believe these teams that I've listed in that particular order are the way in which you should approach the week 17. It's a way to avoid getting complete duds, get guys rested at halftime. Just pay attention. Again, do your research. This stuff might change. We might see Houston saying they're going to play everybody all 4 quarters. We might see them come the other way around. So again, keep up to date with this stuff, but it's a very, very important thing to keep in mind as you play week 17. Moving on here, let's take a quick look at week 16. I'm not going to spend too much time given that I've added a couple of minutes previously regarding week 17 preparation. But for week 16, I had a really good week. I talked about how I flipped over to FanDuel. You can see on the left here are the core plays from the last week 16 video. Most hit, or most are green. The only couple of exceptions was the Dak Prescott Amari Cooper stack. That was just weird. Cooper still got 12 targets, but it was just pretty much a failure by the Cowboys. They're terrible. Joe Mixon, he didn't do very well last week, even though he got a pretty heavy workload. Greg Ward and Jacob Hollister, guys that were kind of on the fence. They didn't kill you. They were cheap, but they didn't do great. And then Zach Ertz, of course, got hurt. But you can see here my best lineup listed in the middle, 174 points. Obviously, points different than DraftKings, but Lamar Jackson really killed it for me. And then I had a number of teams with Ryan Fitzpatrick. So these are just kind of my top 3 teams. I just wanted to give a quick look at week 16, try to be transparent here and show you the guys I did play and the percentage I played them. So moving on to week 17, DFS purposes, core plays, guys that I'll be playing at the quarterback position. Keep in mind, I'm basing this off of the stuff that I gave out earlier in terms of guys and teams that I know will be playing for something. I'm using that as a heavy indicator in terms of picking players. But I'm looking at Ryan Tannehill for Tennessee and Carson Wentz for Philadelphia. Both guys similarly priced on FanDuel, a little bit different on DraftKings here, and kind of in the same situation where it's win and go to the playoffs. Ryan Tannehill for Tennessee, 6,800 on DraftKings, 7,900 on FanDuel. He's an away favorite, pretty big favorite, surprisingly, at Houston at 44.5 over under. Another reason why I'm worried about Houston, I don't think that Tennessee should be that big of a favorite. Vegas indicating that players should be sitting from Houston, so I'm kind of staying away from them. But again, I mentioned it's a win and they lock that last AFC wild card for Tennessee. It's win and go to the playoffs. Simple as that. If they lose, they need help. They need other teams to lose. But Ryan Tannehill has been absolutely on fire over the last few weeks. I believe he's one of the top 5 ranked quarterbacks, Pro Football Focus, on the year. He might be top 3 just behind Lamar Jackson. I'm not totally positive on that, but he's having a great year. It's really good to see him come over from Miami, pick up the spot in Tennessee, and really lead that team. But 23 plus fantasy points each of the last 3 games, really solid at his current pricing. Multiple touchdowns, 2 or more in the last 6 games. He has an elite matchup versus the Houston defense, who's giving up 271 plus passing yards a game on the season and 21 plus fantasy points per game. Top of that, they should be resting some players, so we'll see how that plays out. But Ryan Tannehill in a must-win spot, playing really well. They need him to continue to play well to run into the playoffs. I like Ryan Tannehill this week. Next up, I have Carson Wentz for Philadelphia. Really cheap on DraftKings. A good price at 6,100, 7,700 on FanDuel, so similarly priced to Tannehill. Similar deal here, an away favorite versus the Giants. A small, not the greatest over-under at 45. He's a 3.5-point favorite. Again, another win and go to the playoff scenario. They're just ahead after beating the Dallas Cowboys last week. If they win, they lock up the division and they lock up that last playoff spot for the NFC. I do like Carson Wentz in that situation. Okay, I think the biggest thing to talk about with him is he has literally no weapons on offense right now. Zach Ertz went down, but he proved last game that he can get it done. He's just playing really, really well. He's averaged 44 pass attempts and 21 fantasy points over the last few games. Absolutely excellent through the air with him, even with a downturn in weapons. I'm not too worried about that, especially at his price. And beyond that, he has an excellent matchup versus the Giants defense, who's giving up 200 and almost the same thing as Houston. They're very, very close, both top 5 matchups, but the Giants are giving up 262 plus passing yards a game and 21 plus fantasy points a game. So an excellent matchup. He'll be throwing to some random receivers like Greg Ward, but nonetheless, if they're going to the playoffs, it's through Carson Wentz. They have to win. I think it's all through him. He's been playing excellent. He's getting it done regardless of who he throws to. And beyond that, I mentioned the Giants defense is pretty awful this year. But if you look just over the last couple of weeks, they've been getting murdered through the air. A combination of Haskins and Keenum, 2 bad quarterbacks for Washington, a bad offensive team. They excelled in Week 16 versus the Giants. So I have little worry about Carson Wentz not necessarily having his best weapons, especially at his current price on DraftKings and FanDuel. Moving on to the running back position here, I think this is where you have to be careful. For example, we talked about the Rams and how they might sit players. A player they might sit with nothing to play for is Todd Gurley. So a guy like him, I'm completely avoiding, but I'm, again, paying attention to what information we do have. So for the running back position, guys I'll be building lineups around in Week 17. I'm starting off with Christian McCaffrey for Carolina. In fact, I think he might be the highest owned player in terms of my percentage owned on the entire year this week. I think I'm just going to be pushing him into as many lineups as I possibly can. He's very expensive, $10,000 on DraftKings, $11,000 on FanDuel, but the big thing here is he's one of those guys playing for a record. Yes, Carolina is not doing anything. They're not making playoffs. They have nothing really to play for, but Christian McCaffrey does have something to play for. He's 67 receiving yards from a 1,000 rushing, 1,000 passing or receiving yard year. That will be the 3rd player in NFL history. I believe he can set other NFL records in terms of, I know it's not necessarily important to him, but fantasy points scored in a season. I think he needs like 35-ish PPR points to break and be number 1 all time. But nonetheless, I think this is a great spot. They should be feeding him the ball, being they have nothing else to play for. The coaches even said they want to feed him the ball. They're going to do everything they can to get the ball in his hand and make sure he breaks those records. So again, love Christian McCaffrey. Although they don't have something to play for, they're going to feed him the ball. He had like 15 targets last week. You could see the exact same thing this week with nothing to play for other than getting him that record. Next up here, I have Marlon Mack for Indianapolis. 6,900 on DraftKings, 7,300 on FanDuel. A little pricey, not necessarily this is kind of the biggest risk for me this week at running back, being Indianapolis isn't playing for anything, and I'm picking a running back from them, but the matchup is too hard to ignore. Jacksonville was just so bad. I've been streaming running backs successfully against them for the last couple of weeks. Over the last 4 weeks, they are the number 1, either however you look at it, they're either the last ranked team in the NFL versus running backs, or they're the number 1 matchup for running backs. However you want to look at it, they're giving up 41 plus fantasy points per game to the running back position over the last 4 weeks. If you're playing FanDuel, that's where I'm kind of going this week. He's a good spot. He's going to get 20, 25 carries against a awful Jacksonville defense. Everybody just wants to get out of the season, move on to their vacations and everything else. So I do like Marlon Mack in a good spot versus a very weak Jacksonville run defense. Moving on, we have an Oakland running back here, DeAndre Washington. We know Josh Jacobs is going to be out. Pretty good price here at 5,200 on DraftKings, 6,300 on FanDuel. Oakland is in fact playing for something. They need a lot of things to swing their way actually, but they could theoretically make the playoffs. So they're going to try. They're going to, I don't have any indication that they're going to not try or not try to win the game. I believe they will do that. But the big thing here, obviously, without Jacobs, last week 16, DeAndre Washington had 25 touches. That's a huge volume load for a running back. Things you love to see. You want volume out of running backs. It's a tough matchup versus Denver in Denver this week, but you have a pretty good back here with a lot of volume and getting good value. And the last guy I want to mention here is Aaron Jones for Green Bay. Believe it or not, Green Bay has been successful this year, in my opinion, not because of Aaron Rodgers, but because of Aaron Jones and that offensive line. They are just absolutely running down teams' throats. They have a very good offensive line, a very good running back in Aaron Jones, and I think he's in a good spot this week, mainly because their backup running back, they split carries a lot, but Williams is out. That should boost Aaron Jones' touches. I think you can expect 25 touches out of him, and he has a top 5 running back matchup versus the Detroit Lions. 25 touches. They're playing for something. Green Bay still could get that number 1 seed. Nonetheless, they're still playing for that home field advantage, that first week bye. All that stuff is still in play for Green Bay, so they should be full go, every starter in the game, throughout the game to win that game. I love 25 plus touches against a Detroit Lions team, especially out of an elite back this season, a guy that's scoring a lot of touchdowns in Aaron Jones. Moving on to the wide receiver position, this is where it gets a little dicey in that we have some players picked here. Well, I guess just one player, and that's Julio Jones for Atlanta, my number 1 guy. Atlanta's not really playing for anything, and I'm picking a wide receiver from them, but I think he's just too good. He's in too good of a spot. He's been performing too well to ignore. His price is $8,500 on DraftKings and FanDuel. It's a really good price on FanDuel. He has the single best matchup for wide receivers versus Tampa Bay. Should be an absolute shootout. If everybody is full go in that game, which every indication is everybody for Tampa Bay will be playing and everybody for Atlanta will be playing. I think they extended Dan Quinn into next season, so maybe they have something to prove here. You're hoping they don't bench Matt Ryan. You're hoping they don't bench Julio Jones. I don't think they will. He's had 35 targets over his last 2 games with Calvin Ridley going down with injury, so he's getting massive targets. I just think that's what they're going to do this week. I think they don't really care what happens. They're just going to try to feed him the ball, prove that he's the number 1 receiver in the game, and Julio Jones lands as my number 1 receiver this week against the Tampa Bay Bucks. Awful defense and secondary. A.J. Brown for Tennessee, the guy I'm going to be pairing with Tannehill. He's averaged 22 plus fantasy points per game over the last 5 games in terms of PPR, scoring a lot of touchdowns, getting red zone looks, all the things you like to see. Fits well with Tannehill. Again, they're playing with something to prove. They're trying to make the playoffs, right? They have to win their game. He's a big part of that offense. Yes, Derrick Henry is back, but I think that helps A.J. Brown. I think they can focus. They're going to focus more on Henry. He's going to get a lot of touches, but A.J. Brown, that big, good, young receiver that Tannehill seems to favor. I'm going out on a little bit of a limb here, going with Amari Cooper for Dallas. They are playing at home against Washington in a game in which they're like massive. I think they're 12-point favorites, so it's not always good to favor the passing game. A lot of people are going to be playing Ezekiel Elliott, which I give them credit for. I would do that too, especially if you're playing cash games, single entry games. Elliott in a crush spot versus Washington, but I think Amari Cooper is being priced too low here at $6,500 on DraftKings, especially. I think if you want a GPP pivot in the hopes that they do win by 15 or whatever, but they do it all through the air, Amari Cooper could absolutely crush a very bad Washington team with nothing to play for. He had 12 targets in week 16, although he didn't do much with them, and Dak looked really bad. I do believe he's in a good spot, obviously, versus the Washington Redskins defense, and he has a chance to really, especially at that price, pay off dividends, especially as a GPP pivot off of Elliott. And lastly here, another guy you could pair with one of the quarterback core plays. That's Greg Ward for Philadelphia. I mean, other than who else, I couldn't name another receiver, unfortunately, on Philadelphia right now. He's priced so low. He's $4,700 on DraftKings, $5,600 on FanDuel. He's had 23 targets over the last 3 games. Now you have Zach Ertz out, which is, 10 to 15 more targets that are going to go out there. Obviously, they're not all going to go to Greg Ward, but for that price, he's the only receiver with a name on that team, and the name is only popular because of his targets over the last 3 games. Greg Ward in a good spot. New York Giants are an elite matchup, giving up 40-plus fantasy points per game on average this year. 2 wide receivers, and that's not obviously 1 wide receiver, but to the wide receiver position. So I think Greg Ward in a good spot. If Carson Wentz is going to throw the ball, where's it going to go? Greg Ward's the guy at wide receiver. Switching over to the tight end position here, I want to talk about pretty much that same game. We're talking Philadelphia, Zach Ertz being out. Dallas Goedert is the guy that I want in most of my lineups. He is obviously going to play. Philadelphia has something to play for. They're not going to rest anybody. They literally have no one else to throw to other than Greg Ward, who I just mentioned. But at $4,900 on DraftKings, that's just too cheap. FanDuel was smart. They priced him up a bit at $6,400, but I'm still playing him at that price. I mentioned Zach Ertz is out. That's anywhere from 10 to 15 targets a game. And in fact, last week with Ertz missing time, increased opportunity, Dallas ended up with 12 targets in week 16, as I mentioned, that turned it into 9 receptions, 91 receiving yards, and a touchdown. So if you get that output out of him again this week, which you could possibly get 12, 14, 16 targets out of this guy simply because there's no one else to throw to. I love him this week. I know a lot of people are going to be owning him, but regardless, you got to stick with what you know, and you know that Philadelphia is playing for something. You know he's the only real tight end in town for them right now. He has a receiving history on that team. He's taken some targets away throughout the 2019 season, and there's really no one else to throw to. So I'm sticking with the gun here. I'm sticking with what we know, and I'm going with Dallas Goedert for Philadelphia. The next guy here is a guy you have to pay attention to. I caution you on this, and I think I have his pricing wrong here. In fact, looking at my notes, I definitely do. So Tyler Higbee for Los Angeles Rams, he's $5,900 on DraftKings and I think $6,300 on FanDuel. Regardless, these prices are wrong, so I apologize for that. But we're talking about the Rams. I have them on my maybe list. They are probably going to be resting some players. That's the way it's turning out to be. If that means Jared Goff, I don't know how much I like Higbee, but we talk about it each and every week. The matchup versus the Arizona Cardinals, giving up ridiculous amount of points, just getting torched by tight ends week in and week out. And Tyler Higbee's not a bad tight end. I mean, he's actually been very, very excellent. He's kind of gave whatever push the Rams had over the last few weeks has been in large part due to Tyler Higbee. He's had 36 targets over the last 3 games, no fewer than 15 PPR points, fantasy points per game over the last 5 games. And he's had the big concern last week. I know this was for me at least. Will he continue to play? Because he was a backup tight end when Everett came back. Well, in fact, he did last Sunday, or I guess it would be the Saturday game. He played nearly 90% of the snaps, and then Everett got, I think, 6% of the snaps. So there's little worry. I think he's their tight end of the future. He's a good, athletic, big tight end. Arizona, again, just a beautiful matchup for any tight end. I play almost every tight end, whether he's cheap, nobody against them. Tyler Higbee in a good spot. But again, keep in mind the Rams resting players. If they're going to rest him, I don't know why they would. I think they'll rest Gurley. I think they might bench Goff maybe at halftime. But I think Tyler Higbee in a half with Jared Goff is an excellent option still. So I'll probably be getting some exposure to him. But again, pay attention to what happens in how the week is shaping up. And so that wraps up the Week 17 core plays. Of course, I have some other considerations. The core plays are just that. The guys I'll be building around will be fitting a lot of different guys throughout lineups. I'm a GPP-style player, but I want to mention Jameis Winston for Tampa Bay. I have little doubt he plays the entire game, throws the ball 50 times. He has the chance to be the first, I think, 30-30 quarterback, 30 touchdowns or more and 30 interceptions or more. I think he has 28 interceptions. But Jameis Winston just killing it every single week. He reminds me of Blake Bortles a few years ago for Jacksonville, just absolutely throwing the rock, throwing picks, but coming back and throwing touchdowns. I do love Jameis Winston every week. I'm not scared to play him this week in a good spot. I like Jameis Winston. Alvin Kamara for New Orleans in a good spot in terms of a rushing defense. I think he got a couple rushing red zone rushes last week, which is good to see. He's due for some positive regression in terms of touchdown upside. Hasn't scored a lot of touchdowns, so I like Kamara this week. And lastly, for a very, very cheap receiver, John Ross for Cincinnati. Love him this week versus the Cleveland Browns. Andy Dalton had a great connection before Ross got hurt earlier in the season. You saw that last week coming off an injury, his first week back. I think he had 12 or 13 targets. So for a very cheap dart throw, not even a dart throw, I think he's a solid receiver. So John Ross for Cincinnati. And so hey, that wraps up the Week 7 DFS video here at No Huddle Fantasy Sports. I do wish you guys the best of luck, but keep in mind the 3 things I mentioned. Number 1, playoff scenarios. Who's playing, who's not playing. Number 2, rested players. We've already got some announcements of who's sitting, but keep in mind things will come out tomorrow, early tomorrow, so pay attention. And thirdly, figure out which guys are playing for records. I talked about Christian McCaffrey, but there are other guys possibly out there that could set some personal records, some career records, NFL records, whatever it might be. So keep that in mind. Those are 3 things to keep in mind for Week 17, things that matter, that keep players on the field, which is the most important thing for Week 17. Worst thing in the world is to play a player and he gets basically benched at halftime because they have nothing to play for. So again, keep in mind, keep up to date with all the information. Make sure you do your due diligence in the morning. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. As always, if you haven't done so already, if you're enjoying these videos, please click that like button, smash that subscribe button to stay tuned for more videos. I will be putting out more DFS videos, only DFS videos regarding playoff slates, main slates, DraftKings, FanDuel, so stay attention to that. And then we'll be back in the spring for some MLB action. I do, again, appreciate you guys tuning in, following along all season long. I wish you guys the best of luck, Happy New Year, and I'll see you in 2020.